Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. So I just want to say hello to Ross and Artem and Malcolm and do I say Katerina?
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you, Katerina, and Jose and Suze and Carol, Kelly, Natalia, and Stephen, Natasha. And I understand that we have people from Nova Scotia to Hawaii, and I think that's lovely. One thing that I like to do when I'm online with a geographically dispersed group is ask everyone to look out the window now, just for a second. Just look out the window and look up in the sky. And just now, the 12 of us looked at the same sky in the same time, but we saw different things. I love that analogy that we're together, but we're all unique in our vision that we can see for ourselves. So I come here to ask more questions than say things. I'm in that part of life where the more I know, the more I don't know. And it took me a number of years to be able to say that I'm a recovering academic that allows different ways of knowing and cultivating the spirit directly. So it's been a wild ride, and I wouldn't change a thing. And when I was asked to talk today, I thought about this idea of drops of grace. And I've had that phrase in my mind for decades. And over the years, it's changed. I mean, I understand it differently now, what it is. And but it's not the same at different points in my life or how it comes to me. And so I just wanted to explore with you what is the experience we have when we recognize a drop of grace, or if it knocks us to our knees, or if we feel awe and joy that brings tear to our eyes. What is it? And partly due to my personal journey as well, there's a tearing apart also of a drop of grace. And I'm been on the path for years to understand the relationship between joy and suffering, and how can grace hold both. And as a human being, I'd rather stay in the joy part more than the suffering part, but we don't get a choice. So how do I develop a deeper capacity to just hold suffering and just be existing with it side by side? I think that can be grace as well. So I want to tell you my first drop of grace that I remember, and then the second one. The first drop of grace I remember, I was maybe about 8 or 9 years old. And my family life was pretty bad. And I remember one day just sitting there, and I got this clarity as an 8 or 9 year old. So it was really, on reflection, I really believe it was a drop of grace. And I was all worried about who I was, and I wasn't valuable enough, and all those things that an abused child can think. But then a clarity hit me, and the clarity was this. My life will be a journey of getting back home to myself. And that really has carried me through so much. There was just a certitude to that statement. And why would an 8 or 9 year old think that, right? And it was, I will spend the rest of my life coming home to myself. And yeah, I can't explain it, but I can tell you time and time and time again, it's what gets me up in the morning. What puts a spring in my step. It's what let me stay in the darker places when they happen, and not let them crumble me. Yeah, and so that's the first one I had as a child. And the second one was in about 1997. Yeah, 1997. And you mentioned that I was a consultant in before I went to higher education. And yeah, so this was in my consulting phase. And um, I had this marvelous career by every economic standard a person could have. I worked in Los Angeles, I worked in Seattle, I worked in Connecticut, and then I worked in Manhattan, climbing the corporate ladder. And I had just gotten a big promotion to a big skyscraper in Manhattan. And from a girl with my beginnings from Minnesota, that was pretty cool. So I had all these trappings, look at me, I'm successful. And for some reason, I just felt empty. I really did. I know that sounds so cliche, but I got to that point and I'm like, I wasn't looking for this, but I didn't even have those words. It just felt empty. So I was doing my job. I was getting into a cab, going to the airport, flying to a client, flying home, opening mail, next day flying to another appointment. And I was just on a wheel. And in the second big drop of grace that changed my life was this. I was sitting in the back of this car taking me to the airport. And the drop was, boy, the cost of this limo could pay for a lot of books for inner city schools. Boy, the cost of this limo could pay for a lot of books for inner city schools. And I remember kind of almost looking around the car because I never volunteered. It never even crossed my mind. I was a total, yuppie. We called ourselves the insecure overachievers and all accolades and everything. And then it wasn't really, it just things flowed from there. One of my new coworkers was involved in a faith-based organization and did volunteer work. And it was on workforce development, which is what I was interested in professionally. So we got together and I started working in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I then started to be a big sister to an inner city teenager. Boy, what I didn't know could fill the universe of books. And one thing led to another. And I had this really existential moment thinking, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know who I am. I need to go to the mountains and clear my head. That's what I always did. And so I went to my sister's cabin in Idaho. I love my sister. Climbed up the top of a mountain to be alone. And the next day I climbed up the top of another one. These are day trips. And about the third day I climbed a mountain and I get to the top and I'm sweaty, and you're backpacking and you're dusty and, you're loving it, but you really don't look like much. And I get to the top to have an existential moment. And I look up and there's a fire lookout tower there with a man in it. And I remember thinking, God, I come here to have my existential moment. Why did you put me on a mountain with someone there? And so I decided I'm going to ignore him. I'm going to go to the far side of the top of the mountain and look the other way and eat my lunch. So harumph, I went to the other side of the mountain, faced this beautiful meadow. And after a while, I heard some steps behind me, steps walking towards me. And I was like, doesn't he realize I just came here to be alone? So I turn around, kind of ready to be a New York yucky person. And he's holding out his binoculars and he says, down in the valley there, some mama elks just had some babies. They're really cute. Do you want to see? And I remember looking at him And I said, "Are you from Minnesota?" And he said, "Yes." And so I said, "I am too." Well, we've been married 21 years. He's in the other room waiting for me to cook him dinner. And when I say drop of grace, I mean drop of grace, right? They can be little subtle things, or they can be what I've just kind of described as, for me, two huge things. And did I foster them to come to me or open to them? I don't know. Sometimes they're just happenstance. But I do think that it rains more the more we practice kind of our faith and how we understand the universe and cultivate deeper knowings in ourselves. And the last thing I want to share is that there's always also group drops of grace. And the Quakers called these, oh God, just have a name out of my head. Oh, a gathered meeting. That's what they call it. A gathered meeting. And it's the moment in the meeting when you know everyone knows the right answer. And I've had that experience once in my Quaker meeting house. It's a beautiful feeling. And I had it once online working with Thomas Hubel on traumatic healing. So I'm really willing, I just really want to stop talking now and turn to you guys and see what's coming up. Do you want to share your drops of grace, big or subtle? What's your theory of drops of grace? And have you noticed changes in them over your lifespan?
That was so beautiful, Julia. Thank you. I know I have a few things to share, but let me open up the floor to others. Any reactions, questions, or your stories of drops of grace?
Hi, thank you, Julia. I often don't like these presentations very much, but I liked yours. So thank you for coming. And I'll just say that I've had many of them over my lifetime. And since I've shared some of them here already, I don't want to do that again. But at the same time, I'm a doubting Thomas. Now that these were all a long time ago, and you had that saying on the readings, the doubting Thomas was there. That's sort of me. I have, it seems like I have a lot of reasons to believe, but I doubt. I doubt. Were they really drops of grace, or were they just coincidences and something going on with my physiology that caused me to have wonderful experiences, really? Or were they drops of grace? So at least in the saying, and that was sort of what Jesus says, it's not very good for a doubting Thomas. He's not blessed. It's the people who believe without doubting who are blessed. So that's all. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, two things. One, I don't personally know a single person who hasn't had doubt. I really don't. I'm thinking about it. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing is about these drops and believing in them or not. And, kind of asking, is it a biological chemical reaction in my brain, or is it a neuronal misfire, or, is my default mode? I mean, yeah, all these scientific kind of ways of looking at things. So what I'm working on now is trying to understand the idea of the third eye. It's a metaphor, right? But the indigenous call it two-eyed seeing and one-eye seeing. And I think it's also in the Bhagavad Gita. where two-eyed seeing, you would have um, doubts, and you would see either or on or off. It is a drop of grace or it isn't a drop of grace, like ones and zeros, binaries. I just learned this morning about quantum computing, and they don't use binary one and zeros for their, how do they generate information? They use probabilities. So they're able to hold 1 and 2 together. And I would just challenge you to say, look at the people and the lay people too that write about science and spirituality and quantum thinking, quantum spirituality, and even, you know, like Dan Siegel and those guys, they're like scientists who really can make an argument conceptually and empirically for certain things that have helped me when I talk to my students who I can't teach, I don't teach theology. So how do I invite students to talk about these kind of things of spirituality without it being seen as a cult? I have to load my words up with science and data and evidence. And so, Steve, your question hit home to me. I get those I love these conversations.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'll try to keep everything you said in mind.
Thank you, Steve. Anyone else? Yes, Malcolm.
I liked your second story about moments of grace, because from my teens until into my 60s or 70s, I think one of my greatest sources of happiness was climbing mountains. And it always seemed to me there was a nice kind of analogy between physical height and spiritual elevation. And if I have known moments of grace, and I think I have, they tended to occur on those occasions when I had an extraordinary perspective visually, and I think analogically a kind of spiritual perspective granted by those wonderful experiences in the mountains.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Yeah, that's nature. There's a lot of evidence, science evidence about the benefits of nature for cultivating spirituality and mindfulness and the feeling of interconnectedness. Not only in indigenous societies, this idea of the land and the human-land relationship is very spiritual, but the idea of what was I going to say? The focus on different ways of knowing and how practices of being in nature or practices with being in nature create more of a relationship between the land and the plants and the mountains and the streams. And when one cultivates mindfulness and is in nature, there's a lot of evidence about chemical reactions, neuronal activity. And I bring this in because, you know, there's a lot of biological evidence that's now being discovered that faith leaders knew centuries ago. And I just love that. And it really empowers my work as a scholar because, you know, we've separated religion and science, or spirituality and science, and I think much to our detriment. If we can really show that we knew this 3,000 years ago, you know, let's return to ourselves again.
Super interesting. Julia, one thing I wanted to mention is I do a lot of work in Ukraine and with Ukrainian nonprofits, given my own heritage. And one thing I noticed is that as a collective, people seem to be closer to God there. And I think why that is because uh, there's a lot of suffering there and people hunger God more. And my answer to your question internally was, well, God is there and gives those small drops of grace when we hunger and seek it. And I think that's what Sermon on the Mount is also referring to. I think if we ask for those drops of grace, and we will see more of them if we actively seek it, and whether or not we are in a moment of suffering. So those are my 2 cents.
That's great, Katerina. I really resonated with what you said about yearning for grace and turning to it because of suffering or other challenges. And I don't know about you guys, but I've been through some depressions in my life where I couldn't turn to. I I I I lost it, right? I think for me it was worse than what I understand Steve is he doubts. Um, I didn't care. That's to me this apathy, or in Buddhism they would call it tupor, Tupor. Um, and but I still got them. So there is a miracle that can, to me, that really matters. And yes, we can cultivate getting more of them, but it's in those moments of complete annihilation where you can't even get up off the floor to turn up to God, that he can reach down and comfort us. I think that's just such a gift.
And if I may add, it's helpful as a community to hear that others have gone through these experiences and have been in those lows and saw God with them, even at those moments.
Yeah, I could add very quickly about what you said about depression. One of my drops of grace was exactly sort of like that. I was very depressed, the most in my life, and contemplating suicide, and just all of a sudden it lifted, just like that. Was gone, and I felt that probably for 2 months, good feeling that came from that lasted. So I'm definitely have had an experience like that, but it doesn't stop me from doubting.
That's beautiful, Steve. I'm glad you had that experience. I would really like to hear from others if you'd be so kind to share. I'd like to learn your thoughts about these things, experiences, questions, or something else is on your mind. My husband says I'm a good listener.
Yes, Chris. Go ahead and unmute, please. Let us know if you can.
There we go. No, I did it. Yep. Um, I'm sorry I came in a little bit late, so I didn't get to hear the very beginning. But I do have to say that I've always been intrigued by the concept of grace, because as a child growing up in the Swedenborgian church, somehow or other that word wasn't in our vocabulary. But I am grateful for having learned about experiences that I do believe are God's grace. And I I guess following up on something Malcolm had said earlier, and also you said, that I do know that I'm a city child, but nature has always been of, there's some calling there. And I had a moment as an adult, I was probably in my early 30s when I was in Western Canada and on a driving trip, and we stopped somewhere, Lord knows where, in the Canadian Rockies to look over some switchbacks, train tunnels and things. And I remember standing there and looking at all this glorious beauty, and just suddenly realizing for the very first time in my life that I can recall, and it's a memory I keep because it helps, I was at peace. Um, and it was the most remarkable thing, I grew up in Michigan, and I've certainly had my moments of beauty in different places, but that and just you also mentioned it, and it felt like a gift, and I'm so grateful for it because I've kept it. It's one of those little, almost like a mantra thing that I can dig out when I really need it. And the other thing is I am a musician, and choral music is something I love dearly. I traveled with a choir, and in Michigan we have an old growth forest. It's called Hartwick Pines. And in the 1930s, it was one of those Conservation Corps places. And a chapel was built, a little chapel. It's got about maybe 8 pews altogether, 4 on each side. And it's just out here in the middle of this absolutely glorious old growth, huge pine forest. And I was traveling with a choir, and probably 12 or 13 of us were there, and we had all arrived at the chapel at the same time. And one of the things that we were singing in our performances was a Bach chorale. And I don't know which one of us started it. I have no idea what. But here we are in the midst of this absolutely pristine place. And I'm in this choir, and we are singing this Bach chorale. And it was probably the other time in my life that I keep as moments of just absolute pure God-given moment of peace and joy and fulfillment and everything good. So I just wanted to share those things.
Wow, Chris, thank you. Those are beautiful. Those are really beautiful. And I wanted to ask you because it occurred to me when you were speaking, I was sensing, through your words and how you were saying the words, and thinking, and kind of like experiencing vicariously through your story that moment, those moments that you had in the church and the other one, and I got a body sensation of my just like I felt I was holding my neck a little tight and it just relaxed. So I wanted to bring that in too and ask Chris and others if you've noticed, other ways of knowing a grace drop, like a body sensation or a temperature change or just anything. Do you have any? I just wonder about that because it just happened to me again, Chris.
Hmm. Well, I will say that one of my jobs at one point was to direct handbell choir, and I hadn't really had much experience with handbells. This church needed somebody to direct, and I knew how to do that. And so, um, hmm, how does one say this? I guess if you haven't been in a 5-octave handbell choir, you don't have any idea of the depth, but there are 13 ringers, and I have no idea what the song was, but I was directing and they were ringing, and usually I could hear all the individual bells and thought it was all very nice. But there was a moment, and I can still get chills up and down my spine because there was a moment when they played just a just a measure or two of the music, and I swear to you, it sounded like somebody was playing an organ. It was like all of the overtones connected exactly right, and everything rang together, and it was just a moment. So yes, it was visceral. I mean, it not only sounded wonderful, but it felt great. And I really only experienced that probably twice in, maybe 10 years of directing. But yeah, I think that there is something visceral. It's kind of like if you're extremely anxious and you do some kind of practices to breathe yourself back into um, a state of calm. It's that lifting of your spirit uh, out of the ordinary and into some other level. So I guess that would be my response to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to share about a visceral or embodied or somatic response, or hearing things or seeing things? The reason I bring this up is that a question I have is, how do we experience drops of grace through all of our senses that we have? And through our extra sense, we call it extra sense, but I think it's just faith as part of our makeup. And so we can talk about it and we can put words on it. And yet I'm going to pick up on what Chris said. I think there's a resonance that happens in grace where I think, Chris, you said the overtones were all there, and I used to be a musician, so I mean, like, I got what that meant, and it was just, there's just this clarity and this resonance. And one of my working theories is that this resonance, to me, could be the same as the living word. Because when we hear that, or when we know the living word, it resonates with us over and over and over again, no matter how many times we read it or we think about it. And so it lives on through resonance. So that's a theory that I have. I just want to see, does that sound far-fetched, or what do you think about that?
One thing I'll mention is my former boss who actually came into this space at one point, talked about energy and how, for example, when we come into the same room with another person, we sort of feel their energy, even if we don't know anything yet about them. And I've thought of moments when in those beautiful, peaceful spaces where I felt God is here, there was on an energy level interaction with that. It wasn't necessarily smell, sight, touch, but a feeling of that energy, divine energy around.
Thank you. From what I know about quantum physics, the quantum physicist would agree with you, Katerina, that this idea of coherence uh, exists all throughout the cosmos. And again, a lot of empirical findings in quantum science point to the stuff that wisdom traditions knew thousands of years ago. And just imagine if you're living 3,000 years ago and you didn't need to prove or be proven to that these things happen. They just were taken for granted. Now we have to kind of like fight against all this knowledge from books and valuing science over, I don't know what I call it spirituality or being human, being a steward of the planet rather than extracting materials from it. Yeah. But these kind of community conversations are where we can kind of fill our well, right? And we can learn from and with each other. Oh, I wanted to say one more thing about that drop of grace when I met my husband. So I moved to southern Minnesota, and remember I had that big Manhattan job. I got a job working as a community organizer for a domestic violence shelter. And I had never had a job like that. So I threw myself into another really challenging learning situation. And it wasn't even calculated. That's how profound the shift was in. And it's only on reflection looking back that I can say, whoa, how was I making those decisions? What was leading me? It just seemed natural to me to do it. But when I look back, I was a Manhattan consultant and a community organizer who, when I called, no one would return my calls because they didn't want to talk to me in this community. So these can be they can be really subtle and quiet too. Can anyone share a subtle or quiet one that just gives you comfort or internally just bolsters you?
Well, Chris had spoken about that sublime movement occasioned by the singing of the Bach chorale. And it does seem to me that music can bring us those moments of grace. When I listen to the Bach B minor mass or the choral movement from Mahler's Second Symphony, they seem not to have been humanly composed, but somehow to have been drawn from the heavens. And I find those moments to be moments of special grace.
That brings up to me in my mind when you were reading the beginning. I was brought up Lutheran, and we had a prayer, make me an instrument of thy peace. And here it's make me an instrument of thy grace. And it got me thinking of that word and the difference between peace and grace, and then also being an instrument of grace. So what I was wondering is if you think, Malcolm, that the composers were instruments of grace when they were doing their composing.
That's a nice thought. Somebody once commented that Beethoven's music strives to reach the heavens, but Mozart's music is already made in heaven, which I liked.
The fact that Handel, I believe, composed the Messiah in roughly 25 days suggests something. I think he believed that it was directly from God.
That was Ross. Thank you so much.
Apologies for my computer and its camera.
No worries, no worries.
Well, on that note, I see we're getting close to the top of the hour. Julia, thank you so much for guiding us in today's discussion and really contemplative thought process as to those moments of grace. And as we head into the prayer hour, I just want to add my prayer that we find those drops of grace in our week, this coming week. Julia, thank you so much.
Thank you.